Hi, I'm Carl Weber. Welcome to Video Aided Instruction series on how to write a great research paper. If you've been working your way through the series with me from the beginning, you've come a long way. You've learned how to take the broad, general subject area suggested by your teacher and narrow it into an appropriate topic for a 10 to 15 page research paper. You've learned how to formulate an interesting question about that topic to research, and how to create a working thesis to test, which offers a tentative answer to that question. You've also learned the basics of research, how to find books, articles, web pages, and other materials that contain useful, relevant information about your topic. You've learned how to evaluate those materials so you can decide which ones deserve your reliance and which ones, not so much. And you've learned how to study your research materials and take notes that capture the most vital facts and ideas in a form that will make them easy to access and use when the time comes to write your paper. Now you're almost ready to begin writing that paper, but before you start turning out golden prose, there's one more important step, one that may sound obvious, but one which many students skip over. It's deciding on your central thesis. That means figuring out exactly what you want to say and how you'll support that idea with evidence. This is a crucial step. If you choose a thesis that's weak or unconvincing or boring, your paper will also be weak, unconvincing, or boring. Even worse, if you fail to choose a thesis, your paper will have the flaw that many research papers have. It will end up as a rambling mishmash of separate facts and ideas drawn from your reading and your research, but without any core idea to hold it all together and make it meaningful. You don't want that to happen. So now, let's get started on the crucial task of defining your thesis and figuring out how you'll make a strong, persuasive case in its support. First of all, what is a thesis? Let's begin with a definition. Remember that we started the process of creating the research paper by defining a topic and then developing an interesting question related to that topic. We also chose a working thesis, which was a tentative answer to the question. It's a bit like the hypothesis that a scientist develops to test in his experiments or additional research. Having this working thesis in mind gave us something to focus on as we did our research and reading. We then looked for books, articles, and other materials that would help us decide whether or not our working thesis was correct, incorrect, or needed some kind of modification. And we analyzed everything we read to discover whether it would strengthen our thesis, weaken it, or help us refine or improve it in some way. Well, if research is all about looking for the answer to a question, now we should be ready to answer that question. And that's what the thesis does. The final thesis for your research paper is the answer to the central question you've been investigating. Now, it may be the same as your working thesis, or it might be quite different. If your research showed that your original thesis was very wrong, then your final thesis could end up stating something very different, perhaps even the opposite of your working thesis. More often, your final thesis will be a modification of the working thesis. That is, a version of the original thesis that has been modified, deepened, clarified, and enhanced by all the new facts and ideas you've learned through your research. In other words, the original idea you started with won't be discarded altogether, but instead you've learned so much through your research that you now understand the details much better than you did a few weeks ago, and you're ready to write a paper that explores your ideas in great depth and with great clarity and interest and accuracy, having developed greater insights through your research. Choosing the right thesis is crucial to creating a great paper. How do you go about it? Here are 4 rules to follow. First of all, your thesis must, of course, be supported by your research. It must state an idea, opinion, interpretation, or theory that is backed up by the evidence your reading has uncovered. Next, your thesis must be a positive, non-obvious statement. In other words, it must not be a truism, which is something that is common knowledge or obviously true. Next, it must also not be a tautology, which is something that must be true or cannot be disproved. And finally, your thesis must also be worth arguing and preferably original and interesting. Let's look at an example to illustrate and explain these 4 rules. Now, earlier in this series, we talked about a potential research subject that might come up in a class in American history, namely the election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860. It was one of the crucial elections in American history. It helped lead to the secession of the southern states from the Union and ultimately the Civil War. Now, as you might recall, when we talked about this subject area, we realized that this general subject needed to be made much more narrow and specific if it was to serve as a suitable topic for a 10 to 15-page research paper. After all, entire books could be and have been written about the 1860 election. You need to narrow that subject down quite a bit to make it a suitable focus for just a short paper. After some thought, we decided to focus on the why of the subject, and we formulated this question as a possible focus for our research. How did Lincoln, an obscure politician from the Midwest, win the crucial 1860 election against better-known competitors? Now, this is a pretty intriguing topic. It emphasizes what was surprising and dramatic about the 1860 election, and it holds out the promise that we could delve into one of the greater turning points in American history and uncover perhaps something new or interesting about it. In response to this question, we also developed a working thesis, a possible answer which we could test through our research. Here was our working thesis. Lincoln was elected in 1860 because his ambiguous position on slavery attracted support from various groups who didn't necessarily agree with one another. Now, this working thesis provided a reasonable basis for conducting our research into the topic. It suggested the kinds of reading materials that we might search for, specifically books, articles, and other sources that dealt with the ambiguity or lack of clarity of Lincoln's position on the crucial issue of slavery. In other words, Lincoln was generally opposed to slavery, but he deliberately obfuscated or blurred the lines as to exactly what he would or wouldn't do about slavery in order to not alienate large groups of voters during that 1860 election. And it was this blurring or lack of clarity that enabled him to attract votes even from people who might not have agreed with every nuance of Lincoln's true position on slavery. We also looked in our research for evidence that Lincoln's election was made possible by votes of various groups who actually disagreed with one another about slavery. The idea was that perhaps Lincoln became president not because of his forthright stand on the great question of the day, but partly because he chose not to take a forthright stand. Instead, he was deliberately a bit wishy-washy so that people with various points of view could feel comfortable voting for him. Okay, that's the basis on which we began our research. A few weeks have gone by, and we've spent this time finding books, articles, websites, and other research sources related to our key question. And we've read and studied what all these sources have to say and how they affect our thesis. Now we have to decide what thesis to build our paper around. Now, your decision about what thesis to use will depend, in large part, on what you discovered through your reading. For this topic, you probably would have read all or parts of several books by leading scholars about Lincoln and the election of 1860. You probably also read a number of articles from scholarly journals which would reflect the most recent research and thinking being done by academics about the election. All of these would be considered secondary sources because they were all written sometime after the events that they described, the 1860 election, written by historians or scholars who have studied those events. You probably supplemented these secondary sources with reading from primary sources. Primary sources, remember, are materials written at the time of the events and reflecting the thoughts and observations of eyewitnesses and participants in those events. When we're talking about Lincoln's election in 1860, primary sources might include newspaper and magazine articles that were published at the time, diaries, letters, and memoirs written by politicians and others who took part in that campaign, and other documents dating right back to the time of the events themselves. Now, having read all these secondary and primary materials, you've decided whether or not you still agree with or like your working thesis, which, remember, focused on the ambiguity of Lincoln's position regarding slavery. Let's say that in the course of your research you decided to modify the thesis. You might have discovered, for example, that many writers have already discussed the topic of Lincoln's ambiguous position on slavery. In fact, you found that it turns up in almost every book on the topic. This makes that thesis a little less original and interesting than you'd hoped. But you did find another thesis that seems to be less widely known and equally intriguing. This thesis is the idea that Lincoln's election was based in part on a serious misunderstanding by his Republican followers, namely their belief that the Southern states would not secede from the Union even if Lincoln won the election. According to this idea, which you found mentioned in one of the books you read, if Northerners had realized that the leaders of the South were serious about secession, they probably would not have voted for Lincoln. They would have been so freaked out by the possibility of the Union being split up and a possible civil war that they would have shied away from Lincoln. And instead, Democrat Stephen A. Douglas might well have been elected president. And this would have dramatically changed the course of American history. This, then, could be the new thesis around which our paper will be built. If we were to state this thesis in a sentence, the sentence might go something like this. Lincoln, an obscure politician from the Midwest, was able to win the crucial 1860 election against better-known competitors largely because of a serious miscalculation by his Republican followers, who mistakenly believed that the leaders of the South were not serious about their threats to secede from the Union if Lincoln were elected, and they spread this belief among Northern voters. It's a long, fairly complex sentence, but we need a sentence of that kind to get in all the main points that are part of our thesis. This is what we've discovered from our research, and it's what we've decided to build our paper around. It's going to be the basis for our paper. Now, does this make a good thesis for our paper? To decide, let's test it against our 4 rules as to what makes a good thesis. First, we said the thesis must be supported by your research. Let's assume for now that this is true. A little later in this program, we're going to talk about the kinds of evidence you'll want to have to back up your thesis. If you've got those kinds of evidence from your research and your note-taking, then your thesis should be all right. Next, your thesis must be a positive, non-obvious statement. In other words, it must not be a truism, which is something that is common knowledge or obviously true. Does our thesis fit this rule? Well, it does. The idea that Lincoln was elected on the basis of a misunderstanding by many voters is not common knowledge. It doesn't appear in most or all books about Lincoln and the 1860 election, for example, and it's certainly not a truism, which is something that everybody knows. Now, take some other facts about Lincoln and his life. The fact that Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves in the southern states during the Civil War. That would be a truism, something that everybody knows. And within the world of Lincoln scholarship, the idea that Lincoln's primary objective throughout the Civil War was not to end slavery, but rather to reunify the country, that idea among Lincoln scholars is very well known and qualifies as common knowledge. It's the kind of idea that would appear in virtually every book about Lincoln and the Civil War. So that idea would be common knowledge and wouldn't make a very good thesis. These ideas of common knowledge or truisms, neither of those defines or applies to our thesis about the Republican misunderstanding of Southern intentions. So our thesis seems to pass muster in the sense that it is not a truism, nor is it common knowledge. It's an original piece of information, something that is not obvious and that is not widely known, and therefore could make an interesting and useful thesis for our paper. We also said that a thesis must not be a tautology, which is something that must be true or that cannot be disproved. Now, what about our thesis that Lincoln was elected, at least in large part, because of a misunderstanding by Republican voters as to the intentions of the South? Could this thesis be disproved or shown to be false? The answer is yes, it certainly could. It could be disproved. How? By showing that most Republicans did not commit the mistake described in the thesis. In other words, if you could show that most Republicans took the threat of secession seriously and voted for Lincoln despite that, then our thesis would fall apart. If this is true, then the statement in the thesis would be false. So our thesis is falsifiable. That is, it is possible to disprove it with the right evidence, and therefore it is not a tautology. Now, you might be puzzled by this concept of a tautology, an idea that cannot be disproved. Here's an example of a tautology. Lincoln was able to win the election of 1860 because he managed to enlist the support of enough voters throughout the country so as to piece together a majority of the ballots cast in the Electoral College. Now, at first glance, this sounds somewhat similar to our thesis. It's also an explanation as to how Lincoln managed to win the election of 1860. What makes this a tautology, something that can't be disproved and therefore not appropriate as a thesis? The answer is, this is how presidential elections work in the United States. The winner of the election is the person who receives a majority of the votes cast in the Electoral College. The votes in the Electoral College, in turn, are determined by the popular vote in each state. So in this statement, when we say that Lincoln won the election by gathering a majority of the Electoral College votes, that's simply just another way of saying he won the election. It's almost like saying Lincoln won the election because he won the election. That's what makes it a tautology. It's a statement that must be true because it's simply a matter of definition based on the system of voting in this country. It sounds like a thesis at first, but when you analyze it, you see that it's really saying nothing, and that's why it would make a terrible thesis for your research paper. That's an example of a tautology and the kind of thing to be very careful to avoid when crafting your thesis. Finally, we said that your thesis must also be worth arguing and preferably original and interesting. Again, this thesis passes muster. It's an interesting idea and worth arguing about because it suggests something intriguing about one of our country's most important turning points. Namely, it suggests that the course of events leading up to the Civil War was dramatically affected by a simple misunderstanding or breakdown of communication. The South was telling the North, we are going to secede if Lincoln is elected, but the North simply didn't believe that they meant it. If this statement is true, it could change the way most people view the presidency of Lincoln and the Civil War. Perhaps the conflict wasn't quite as inevitable as we usually assume, but might have been averted if people on both sides of the conflict had understood one another's motives and intentions better. So this thesis states an idea which is interesting and worth exploring, worth arguing about, because it would change the way we view both Lincoln and his presidency and the Civil War itself. Finally, is our thesis original enough? Well, as we've mentioned, it's an idea that a couple of other historians have previously suggested, so it's not completely original. It doesn't come out of left field, and it's not a completely unheard of idea. However, in a field like American history, and in particular in the world of Lincoln and Civil War studies, it's hard to come up with an idea that is both completely original and sensible. There are so many thousands of scholars and amateur historians working in this field that almost every possible idea has been suggested by someone, and the only completely original ideas in this field would probably be wacky ones. I guess you could come up with a thesis like Abraham Lincoln was really a space alien who landed on Earth from a flying saucer, and that would probably be pretty original, but it would be so bizarre that it wouldn't make a very good thesis for your research paper. So in a crowded field like American history, it's very difficult to come up with an idea that is totally original. Your best strategy is probably to take a somewhat little-known idea like this one and then add your own original twist to it. How can you do that? Well, one way to do this would be to do original research into evidence for and against the thesis. For example, you might delve into primary sources like diaries and newspapers that haven't been used very much to see whether or not they support the thesis. Another way of adding your original twist to this idea would be to focus on some narrow, specific aspect of the thesis and then examine that in a fresh way that hasn't previously been done by many scholars. For example, you could take this thesis and focus specifically on one crucial election state, let's say Pennsylvania. You could research specifically what voters and politicians in Pennsylvania were thinking and saying about the Southern threat of secession. And you could see how their attitudes and ideas influenced the votes in Pennsylvania. And since Pennsylvania was an important state that helped to turn the election toward Lincoln, this could be a very interesting aspect to explore. Again, something that's original, that hasn't been done before, and which would help to explain an important event in American history. Any of these would be good ways to give a unique and original spin to a thesis that in itself is not totally original. Now, as you can tell from this example and the way we've explored it together, your thesis isn't really something that you sit down and decide in just a few minutes at the end of the research process. Instead, your thesis is an idea that emerges gradually as you read about your topic, as you think about it, and as you analyze and compare the sources of information that you uncover through your research. Little by little, your thesis will become clearer and stronger in your mind as you read and think about the subject, until hopefully, as the deadline for handing in your paper approaches, your thesis will crystallize for you and you'll realize, this is exactly what I want to say. So formulating a thesis is, in one sense, a natural process. It's simply the emergence of a clear concept as to what your research tells you, a clear answer to the question that you started your research with. However, it's important to realize that you need a thesis to write a great paper. It won't just happen by itself. And it's also important to keep in mind the 4 rules that we offered as to what makes a very good thesis as opposed to a thesis that's not so good. You need to be thinking about these rules and about the need for a thesis throughout your research and be looking for the right thesis as you work. And that way, you'll recognize it when it finally does emerge. Now, once you've arrived at your thesis, and before you start drafting your paper, sit down and state your thesis in a sentence. Write it out on a piece of paper and tack it up over your desk or put it in a computer file that you look at every day. Your thesis can serve as a guide and a reminder as to what you want to say in your paper, and it will make writing your first draft of the paper a lot easier. It will give you a focus that will enable you to keep on target as you begin writing the paper itself. You'll probably want to include this sentence, which states your thesis, somewhere in your paper, perhaps with some revision or rewriting. But in any case, writing it out for your own purposes before you start drafting your paper is an important step, because it will clarify for you exactly where your paper is going. And that way, it'll help you avoid the danger of writing a formless ramble that actually leads nowhere, a problem that all too many research papers end up exhibiting. Now, choosing the right thesis will get you halfway there to creating a persuasive paper. But the second half of the journey is just as challenging. Now you have to support your thesis with evidence, facts, and ideas that will help your reader understand your thesis and convince him or her that your thesis is correct. Here's where the value of your research comes in, of course. If you've done a good job of absorbing information from your research sources, and if you've taken clear, thorough notes that capture the most relevant and interesting details, then you should have a wealth of evidence to talk about in your paper. Having stated your thesis in a sentence, you should now start going through your notes and picking out the facts and ideas that are most relevant to that thesis. Look for items that help to explain the thesis, that help to show that it's true, or that may call it into question or weaken it, or that sharpen, focus, clarify, or modify the thesis. All of these may be important to include in the paper. Of course, the exact nature of the evidence that you'll draw upon and include in your paper will depend on the topic, the kind of paper you're writing, and the subject area in which you're working. But here are some of the types of evidence that are most commonly deployed in research papers. These are the kinds of evidence that you should be looking for as you do your research, and now, when you're ready to begin planning the actual paper, these are the kinds of things to pick out from your research notes. First, definitions of terms. In most research papers, it's important to explicitly define and explain what you're talking about. Otherwise, there'll be plenty of opportunity for misunderstanding or confusion, and your thesis may end up seeming unpersuasive to your reader just because the reader doesn't comprehend it clearly. Now, sometimes you'll draw standard definitions from research sources, while in other cases you'll pick one definition out of several that could be chosen. Either way, you'll probably need to cite one or more research sources to explain and defend your definitions. Here's an example. In the thesis that we've been talking about so far related to Lincoln and the election of 1860, we've referred to the intentions of Southern leaders, that is, their intention to secede from the Union. But that's a term that actually needs definition. It might sound obvious, but if you think about it, it's really not. Who specifically are we referring to under the heading of Southern leaders? Are we talking about, for example, members of Congress from the Southern states? Are we talking specifically about people who were avid supporters of the idea of secession? Are we talking about military leaders like Robert E. Lee, who was part of the United States Army at this time? Are we talking about journalists, writers, and political thinkers who were advocating secession? Who exactly are we referring to when we say Southern leaders? We need to define the term, because otherwise we might run into a situation later in the paper where our reader might say, you refer to so-and-so as if he was a Southern leader, but I don't think of him as a leader at all. You need to be clear about your terms, define them early on in your paper so that people who read the paper will understand exactly who or what you're referring to under each of the terms that you use. So look closely at your thesis. Notice any words or phrases whose exact meaning could be unclear, and then work out a clear definition based on your research sources, how other people in the field use the terms, or coming up with a definition of your own if there is no standard definition. And that clear definition will be part of the evidence that you'll be using in your paper to explain and defend your thesis. Your paper then should define, in this case, who you consider to be the main Southern leaders, to name them, and to explain how you decided to use these particular people to illustrate the thesis. A second type of evidence to be thinking about is accounts of events that suggest a cause and effect relationship. Most often, your thesis will be trying to explain how or why something happened. And this will be true no matter what subject area your paper is based in. Certainly, it's true of a history paper like this one, but it could also be true of a paper in the humanities, a paper about a work of literature or art. It could be true about a paper about science or one of the social sciences like psychology or economics. In many, many cases, a thesis will be talking about how or why things unfolded, why events occurred as they did. In other cases, your thesis will be trying to show a relationship among things or ideas, often a relationship that most people aren't aware of. In all of these cases, we're talking about cause and effect relationships. We're talking about one thing leading to or producing or helping to generate something else. To support your thesis, then, you'll need to show how one event could lead to another in a clear and convincing fashion. For example, in our paper about Lincoln, we're trying to suggest that Republican voters didn't take seriously the Southern threats about secession. So in our paper, we need to show how and why this would have happened. In other words, we need to demonstrate that a real cause and effect relationship actually occurred. To explain this, we'd want to show how Southern politicians had, in the past, prior to 1860, threatened to secede and then failed to act on those threats. If we could find evidence that Southern politicians had talked about secession in 1848 and 1854 and 1857 and then had simply failed to act on those threats, they had not followed through and gone ahead with secession, this would tend to suggest a cause and effect relationship between the threats they made in 1860 and the attitude toward those threats that was taken by Northerners. When the Southerners made the same threats in 1860 as they had been making for the previous 10 or 15 years, many Northerners assumed that those threats were meaningless. Based on what we know of human nature, this is a logical cause and effect relationship. When people make empty threats and fail to follow up on them, the cause produces the effect of disbelief later on. It's the old story of crying wolf. When someone threatens to do something and then fails to do it, people don't believe them when they later make the same threat. So if we could show that pattern of events from years prior to 1860, that would help to establish a cause and effect relationship that would make sense in explaining the events of 1860. And describing how these events unfolded in your paper would provide strong evidence in support of your thesis. Another type of evidence that may be important for a paper is statistics or other numerical data. For many kinds of papers, numbers can be an important kind of evidence. This is certainly true in the natural sciences. For example, let's say you were working on a paper describing research into a particular healthcare problem. You would probably want to mention statistics in this paper about the incidence of the disease, what populations suffer from it most often, and what results have been found for experiments into particular kinds of treatment. And all of these would take the form of numbers or statistics that would be appropriate to include in your paper. They would help to explain whatever your thesis is about that particular healthcare problem. Statistics can also be important in other kinds of papers outside of the natural sciences. Take a look at our paper about the election of 1860, for example. It's very likely that in this paper we'll want to mention vote counts in particular states. For example, you might want to show that if just a small percentage of voters in New York State had changed their minds about voting for Lincoln, he would have fallen short of obtaining a majority in the Electoral College. That would have thrown the election into the House of Representatives for a final decision, and Lincoln would probably not have emerged as president. So a specific type of number, in this case election results, could be extremely relevant in a history paper like the one we're talking about here. Numbers can even be relevant in the humanities. Let's say you're writing about a particular chapter in Herman Melville's great novel, Moby Dick, and you want to show how this particular chapter is strongly influenced by imagery from the Bible. One piece of evidence that you might want to show would be the number of references to biblical imagery that appear in the chapter. You might simply flip through the pages and count 1, 2, 3, 4 and show that there were 32 references to the Bible in this one chapter. That strongly suggests that Melville had the Bible on his mind when he drafted that chapter. That kind of number would strengthen your argument. So numbers or statistics can be very relevant as evidence for papers of any kind. Another type of evidence to look for and include in your paper is individual examples that suggest a broader pattern. One way of making any paper more interesting, vivid, and persuasive is by including specific examples of people, events, incidents, or facts that illustrate and support your thesis and represent a broader pattern. Now, examples like these are sometimes referred to as anecdotes, and sometimes literary critics and others speak of anecdotes disparagingly. They use dismissive phrases like saying, oh, that's just anecdotal evidence. You can't believe an argument based on anecdotes. Now, it is true that an anecdote by itself doesn't prove anything, and when you write your paper, it's important not to state or imply that an anecdote proves something. Politicians love to use anecdotes in their speeches because they add human interest. So someone giving a speech about a wartime problem, for example, might introduce a soldier's family in the audience and tell the story of how that soldier went to war and about the heroism of that particular soldier. It's a wonderful, heartwarming moment and a great anecdote, but in itself, of course, it doesn't prove that the politician's point of view about the war is correct. We'd have to look at the experiences, perhaps, of thousands of soldiers to really know whether the policies being followed in the war are the right ones or the wrong ones. So there certainly can be a danger in relying heavily on an anecdote as if it proves anything. But when there's a good reason to believe that a particular anecdote does represent one of many examples that could be found and mentioned, then it's perfectly fair and often very effective to use an anecdote or two to illustrate your thesis. Let's take our Lincoln paper as an example. You could use an anecdote about a real-life voter who voted for Lincoln after deciding to ignore the Southern threats to secede, and this would make a great way to illustrate your thesis. You might find such an anecdote in a history book or paper, or even in a bit of primary source material. For example, you could find a voter's diary or letter in which the voter said, well, I don't believe these Southerners when they say they threaten to secede. I think they're going to stay in the United States, and that's why I voted for Lincoln. This is just an anecdote, and yet it's a useful one because it demonstrates that there were at least some voters who did think this way. Again, that anecdote doesn't prove that your thesis is correct, but it can help readers to understand your thesis, makes the thesis more vivid and meaningful, and it can therefore help to make the thesis seem more convincing. So individual stories or examples can be good pieces of evidence to include in your paper, provided you don't lean on them exclusively. Next, another kind of evidence to look for is facts or ideas from primary sources. In our Lincoln paper, facts or ideas from primary sources, again, that's materials written at the time of the events, would be very important to include to prove or demonstrate our thesis. These kinds of primary sources could include statements made by people in 1860 about their attitudes toward the Southern calls for secession, could include statements by the Southern politicians themselves, or speeches by Republican politicians talking about their attitudes toward the South, could also include accounts by newspaper writers about how and why people voted for Lincoln. For example, it's a fact that Lincoln himself wrote a letter to one of his supporters in which he said, quote, "The people of the South have too much of good sense and good temper to attempt the ruin of the government," close quote. This is a piece of primary evidence because it was written by Lincoln at the time, and it helps to show that Republican leaders like Lincoln were telling the voters that it was safe to vote for Lincoln because the secession threat was just a bluff. Now, of course, as it turned out, Lincoln and his fellow Republicans were wrong about this point. The South was very serious about breaking up the Union. So when Lincoln said, "Oh, the South really doesn't mean it," Lincoln was actually wrong. It was a mistake that helped to change the course of history, and that's the point of your thesis. Lincoln's statement becomes an excellent piece of primary research material that's a useful piece of evidence to help to demonstrate that your thesis has some strong basis in fact. And another type of evidence to be looking for, to include in your paper, is facts or ideas from secondary sources. Remember that secondary sources would be materials written by historians, scholars, students, and other experts after the events that you're describing. So a biography of Lincoln, or a history of the Civil War, or a scholarly paper about the election of 1860, any of these would be a good secondary source. If your notes contain facts or ideas that you've drawn from secondary sources, and these support your thesis or help to clarify or modify it, then you probably want to mention them either through direct quotation in your paper or by paraphrasing them. For example, when researching Lincoln's election, you might have come across this statement by Allen Nevins, who happens to be a distinguished historian of the Civil War. Nevins wrote, "The cardinal error of the Republicans," and he's talking about during the campaign of 1860 now, "the cardinal error of the Republicans was their failure to deal candidly with the now imminent danger of secession." In other words, Allen Nevins is making the point that the Republicans weren't very honest or forthright about the problem of secession. They acted as though it wasn't really much of an issue, when in fact it was the major issue hanging over the country. And Allen Nevins describes this as the cardinal error, the most important mistake that the Republicans made. Now, the fact that a famous historian like Allen Nevins said this doesn't prove your thesis, of course, even though he clearly agrees with your thesis. But it does offer support for your thesis by showing that a respected scholar has voiced the same opinion as you, and so you'd probably want to quote this in your paper. One more kind of evidence that you'll want to look for and include in your paper is evidence related to alternative theses. Now, sometimes there's a clear alternative to your thesis. In other words, another point of view about your topic that is obvious or widely known, and therefore that needs to be considered. If you ignore alternative theses in your paper, then whoever reads your paper, including your teacher, is likely to say, well, this person has overlooked an obvious alternative explanation. I wonder why they haven't talked about it. Either they never heard of that idea, they never thought of it, or else they know that idea is really better than their own, and so they're deliberately avoiding it. All of those are the wrong kind of impression. You don't want your reader to think that you're avoiding talking about alternative ideas just because you have no response to them. When there is an obvious or well-known alternative thesis, you should address it in your paper and at least briefly discuss the evidence that tends to support or weaken that alternative thesis. Let's change gears and consider a different example. Let's say you're writing a paper about Darwin's theory of evolution, and your topic is the reason for Darwin's 20-year delay in publishing his theory after developing it. As we discussed in another program in this series, Charles Darwin developed his theory of evolution by the late 1830s, but he didn't publish any writings about it until the late 1850s, a very unusual and surprising 20-year delay in making public a very important new scientific idea. Many scholars and historians have come up with different theories as to why Darwin might have chosen to delay to publish his revolutionary ideas about evolution. And from doing your research into Darwin's life and background, you've come up with your own explanation, the one that you think best suits the facts. The thesis you've decided upon states that Darwin held back on publishing his ideas about evolution because of his worries over the political implications of the theory. Specifically, Darwin was afraid that his theory of evolution might be misused by anti-religious socialists whose politics Darwin hated. You learn from your research that Darwin was rather conservative in his personal life and that he was very opposed to the socialist doctrine which was spreading through England and Europe in the time of Darwin's life. And when Darwin learned that socialists who believed in eliminating private property and also were opposed to the influence of the church and of religion, began expressing interest in and support for ideas about evolution, Darwin was horrified. He hated the idea of giving any more ammunition to these socialist thinkers whose ideas were anathema to him. So this is the thesis you've decided to work on in your paper, to show that Darwin was concerned about the political ramifications of his theory, and that was what made him hold back for 20 years before publishing his theory. Now, in your paper, you would, of course, present evidence that supports your thesis about Darwin. For example, you'd want to show that socialist magazines that were attacking the church were already beginning to publish articles about evolution, even before Darwin's ideas were published. And if you could find evidence that Darwin was aware of the existence of these magazines, that would be even better. So, for example, if somewhere in a letter by Darwin or one of Darwin's diaries, he mentioned how much he hated the socialists and mentions having seen a socialist magazine that talked about evolution, that would strengthen your thesis, wouldn't it? Because it would suggest that you're right when you say that Darwin was aware of the political implications of his theory and that he definitely didn't want to give further ammunition to the socialists. So all these kinds of evidence supporting your thesis would be important to include in the paper. However, you would also want to present evidence related to the alternative theses. And as we mentioned in another program in this series, historians have come up with a variety of theses about why Darwin delayed publication of his theory. Some have said that it was his bad health that held him back, that he didn't have the time or the energy to collect enough fossil evidence and other materials that would support his theory. He wanted to do this before publishing the theory. Some said that Darwin was anxious about personally facing the religious controversy that he knew his theory would create. These are all alternative theses, some of which you probably need to address in your paper, because not only are you saying in your paper, my thesis about Darwin's motivation is the correct one, you're also saying, by implication, all the other theses that other historians have come up with are wrong or are less good than mine. So, for example, you've decided to reject the alternative thesis which states that Darwin delayed publication of his theory because of his health problems. Now, Darwin did in fact have serious health problems, so what kind of evidence would weaken the thesis that the health problems were the reason for the delay in publication? If you could find evidence that shows that Darwin's health problems were caused by his anxiety about evolution rather than the other way around, that would be good evidence to include in your paper. You might want to devote a page or two to recapping that evidence. So if, for example, you could show that the cause and effect relationship was really such that Darwin began to experience serious health problems only after he developed his theory of evolution, and whenever he thought about publishing the theory of evolution, his back went out, or he suffered indigestion or other kinds of health problems, that would tend to suggest that the health problems were actually caused by his anxiety over the theory of evolution, rather than that the health problems prevented him from publishing the theory. Again, no single piece of evidence will prove the case, but that type of evidence would help to suggest that this alternative theory about health reasons delaying the publication of the theory, that this thesis is weaker than your thesis that you're trying to prove in the paper. So whenever you come up with a thesis, not only do you want to present all the evidence supporting your thesis in the paper, but if there are strong alternative theses that are well known and that your teacher has probably heard of, you probably want to devote some time in your paper to presenting the evidence that weakens those alternative theses. Because evidence that weakens any alternative thesis, of course, indirectly strengthens your preferred thesis. And if you want your paper to be truly persuasive, you need to not only show that your thesis is right, but also that the other theses are wrong. Now, what we've given you in the last few minutes isn't a complete list of every possible kind of evidence that could be used in a research paper, but it illustrates the most important types of evidence that you should be looking for as you do your research, and especially as your thesis takes shape. Formulating the right thesis and then picking out an impressive array of relevant evidence to support it will carry you a long way toward your goal of crafting a powerfully persuasive paper. Now, if you've ever watched a TV courtroom drama, and we all have, you know that presenting some evidence to support your ideas isn't necessarily enough to win your case. You also need to avoid misusing the evidence you present. Otherwise, whoever reads your paper, your teacher in the first instance, will want to jump up and yell, "I object, that's irrelevant," as they read. And if that happens often enough, it may ruin your chances of persuading the jury and earning the high grade you want. Philosophers, scientists, logicians, and other experts in the art of clear thinking have studied the ways in which evidence gets used or misused for centuries. And these experts have developed lists of what are called fallacies. These are errors in logic that often occur when people are trying to persuade one another. Logical fallacies certainly crop up in lots of research papers, and when they do, they damage the credibility of the author and lower his or her grade. Fallacies also crop up in many other places, from TV commercials to political speeches. In the next few minutes, we're going to look at 6 of the most common types of logical fallacies. The names that I provide may be unfamiliar, but the logical errors that they represent are probably familiar to you, just from a lifetime of watching TV, listening to politicians, reading letters to the editor, and arguing with your friends about your favorite topics from sports to music. Be on the lookout for these fallacies in the research materials you read, and of course, be careful to avoid committing them in your own writing. Here's the first fallacy to watch out for: unclear use of terms. Now, when the writer of a research paper fails to define his or her terms clearly, or uses them in ways that are inconsistent or misleading or confusing, the result is this fallacy called unclear use of terms. And it makes any conclusions that are drawn by the writer unpersuasive and questionable. Now, suppose, for example, that you're writing a paper on this thesis. Although the ideas of Malcolm X have become widely known and highly influential in the decades since his death, at the time of his assassination, his philosophy was actually shared by very few leaders in the civil rights movement. Okay, that's our thesis. Our thesis is about Malcolm X's philosophy and about how widely known, respected, and followed it was at the time of his death. When he died in 1965, was Malcolm X widely regarded as the great leader of the black civil rights movement? Were his ideas considered on the fringe, or were they in the mainstream? Did Malcolm X have a wide array of followers, as he does today, or was he relatively little known? That's what you've explored in your research, and you've decided that the evidence shows that his philosophy was actually shared by very few leaders in the civil rights movement. In other words, Malcolm X was not the person that all the other civil rights leaders looked to for guidance. Instead, most of them disagreed with his point of view. That's your thesis, and that's what you're going to try to prove in your paper. Now, in doing this, you would need to define clearly what you mean by each of the terms in your thesis. As we've said, clear definition of terms is an important kind of evidence to include. That would include, in this case, for example, a clear definition of what you mean by the ideas of Malcolm X. Are you referring by this phrase to all of Malcolm X's ideas, or just his ideas specifically regarding certain particular topics, whether it be racial equality, the use of violence to defend black rights, the validity of integration versus segregation, the proper roles of blacks and whites in the civil rights movement. Are any or all of these ideas included, or just certain selected ones? Do we mean to include the various ideas that Malcolm X espoused throughout his life, from his 20s until the time of his death? Or are we including just the ones that he espoused consistently throughout his public career? Or are we talking just about the ideas that he held at the end of his life? Are we going to focus just on things he said in the last year from 1964 to 65? Now, are we going to include ideas expressed by Malcolm's followers and close associates? If someone gave a speech in which he said, "I'm speaking on behalf of Malcolm X and our entire movement," would you consider those ideas to be part of Malcolm X's philosophy or not? All of these are issues that you need to think about and make decisions about before you write your paper. You want to include a clear definition. And if you fail to answer these questions, or even worse, if you change the definition or your answers to these questions from one page of your paper to the next, depending on which definition is most convenient or easiest to work with, then you would be guilty of this fallacy. Once you've defined your terms, you want to use them consistently throughout the paper. Quite often in research papers, and for that matter in other forms of discourse, people seem to be defining a term one way on page 1, and then on page 5 or 6, suddenly you find them bringing in examples that don't really fit the definition they gave back on page 1. That type of inconsistency undermines the logic of a paper. It's a serious fallacy, and it's one to avoid. Here's a second type of fallacy to watch out for. It's called post hoc ergo propter hoc. This is a Latin phrase. You should learn to quote it. People will be impressed by the fact that you know these words in Latin. And it means in Latin, after this, therefore, because of this. What post hoc ergo propter hoc thinking is all about is making mistakes in understanding cause and effect relationships. It describes the fallacy of assuming that when A occurs before B, that means A must have caused B. Remember that a cause and effect relationship doesn't exist every time two things happen in sequence. There must also be good, logical, sensible reasons to assume that one thing might cause the other, as well as good reasons to eliminate other possible causes. Furthermore, the idea of cause and effect is further complicated by the fact that many things in life have two or more causes. It's not always possible to identify one and only one cause for any given effect. You're guilty of post hoc ergo propter hoc reasoning anytime you make a mistake about cause and effect relationship. Let's say that you notice in your research on Malcolm X that several important members of the civil rights movement made speeches explicitly rejecting Malcolm X's philosophy, and especially his statements supporting militant self-defense by black people. They made these speeches in late 1963 and early 1964. Can you think of any historical event that correlates with? Well, this time period is right after the assassination of President Kennedy, which occurred in November 1963. This might make you assume the existence of a cause and effect relationship. You might say, oh, look at this. An act of political violence, the murder of President Kennedy, has moved the civil rights leaders to speak out against such violence and therefore to reject Malcolm X, who in some of his philosophical statements said that black people had a right to use violence to defend their own rights. And therefore you might jump to the conclusion that Malcolm X's philosophy was rejected as part of a national reaction to the Kennedy assassination. Now, this might or may not be true. There might be a cause and effect relationship between the fact that Kennedy was killed in November '63 and soon thereafter civil rights leaders made speeches denouncing Malcolm X. But it's just an assumption, and if you state it as fact without evidence, then you're guilty of post hoc reasoning. You're guilty of the fallacy of assuming a cause and effect relationship where one doesn't necessarily exist. Just the coincidence of dates doesn't prove the cause and effect relationship. You need additional evidence to show that there's a real connection between the two events, namely the assassination and the speeches. So, for example, if you could show quotations from civil rights leaders in which they said, well, Kennedy's assassination had led me to think more about my opposition to violence, and this made me want to turn away from Malcolm X. Well, that would be very strong evidence that would demonstrate that there was a true cause and effect relationship. You can even sometimes show a cause and effect relationship, or at least strongly suggest one, just by showing a preponderance of evidence pointing to the correlation in time between the two events. So if, for example, you studied all the speeches of the leading civil rights leaders as carefully defined by you throughout 1962 and 1963 up until Kennedy's assassination, and found that none of them went out of their way to denounce Malcolm X and the idea of racial violence, but then immediately after Kennedy's assassination, within a short few-month period, several of them gave major speeches in which they did denounce violence and Malcolm X, then you could say, okay, there's a pretty strong cause and effect relationship here, especially the fact that no speeches like this were given before the assassination, and suddenly after the assassination, a lot of them were given. You haven't proven a cause and effect relationship, but at least you've strongly suggested it, and you could then include the evidence in your paper without being guilty of post hoc reasoning. But if you simply assume, well, the two things happen together, there must be a cause and effect, then you'd be guilty of post hoc ergo propter hoc, and that's a logical fallacy that you want to avoid. Our next logical fallacy is called hasty generalization. This fallacy occurs whenever you base a conclusion on a small or flimsy body of evidence. Sometimes, for example, a writer will present one or two anecdotes about individual incidents that they may have read about or even witnessed, and imply that these represent a broad range of experiences without offering any evidence to support that assumption. So, for example, suppose you wanted to show that very few leaders of the civil rights movement were actually supporters of Malcolm X's philosophy during his lifetime. If you wanted to prove this, it wouldn't be good enough to quote one or two such leaders making negative statements about Malcolm. You would need to present a much broader range of evidence, showing statements by several of the most prominent civil rights leaders, and also comments that were written by informed observers, such as journalists at the time. Otherwise, you'd be guilty of hasty generalization. If you base a broad conclusion on just one or two little facts, you're generalizing too quickly, and you're guilty of hasty generalization, a logical fallacy which undermines the persuasiveness of your paper. Our next fallacy is called straw man. What does this mean? Does it have something to do with the Scarecrow in The Wizard of Oz? Well, something close. As we've seen, it's important to consider alternative theses in your paper. In other words, to look at other people's approach or point of view about your thesis. And whenever it's possible, you want to show the evidence that weakens those alternative theses. Whenever you can undermine the opposing point of view, you're strengthening your own. You're saying, well, those other ideas are clearly wrong, therefore you've got to come back to my idea. That helps to make your paper more persuasive. However, the wrong way to do this is to set up what we call a straw man and then knock him down. A straw man argument is a weak, flimsy, inaccurate summary of the alternative thesis. Whenever you describe an opposing point of view in an unfair way that makes it sound foolish and silly, then you're guilty of straw man reasoning. You're setting up a scarecrow, knocking him down, and then saying, see how powerful I am. Really doesn't work as a logical strategy. We see straw man reasoning frequently in politics. Let's say candidate A is running against candidate B. Candidate A is likely to give a speech accusing candidate B of wanting to give away our tax money to lazy people who refuse to work. And candidate B may respond by saying, well, candidate A wants to cut loose poor people and let them starve in the streets. From these two speeches, we get the idea that candidate A wants to be a little more strict on welfare payments. Candidate B wants to be a little less strict. But in both cases, the candidates are guilty of straw man arguments. They're taking the opposing point of view, describing it in such an exaggerated way that it just sounds ridiculous. When you listen to candidate A, you want to say, well, candidate B sounds like a lunatic. And when you listen to candidate B, you want to say, well, candidate A sounds like he's crazy. Both of them are really being unfair and lying, and they're guilty of the straw man fallacy. Suppose in a paper on Malcolm X, you were to write something like this. Malcolm X has become so famous and so revered that many people assume he was the most prominent and admired civil rights leader of his time. In my paper, I will show that this was not the case. Okay, you're trying to present your thesis that Malcolm X was, in fact, rather little known and was not widely followed or admired at the time of his death, that the adulation that he has later received all came later, after his assassination. to introduce this thesis, you have just stated that many people assume that Malcolm was the most prominent and admired civil rights leader of his time, and you said you're going to disprove that. Well, you're really setting up an example of straw man reasoning. Why? Because the point of view that you are summarizing, in which you say you're going to disprove, is probably an exaggeration of what most people actually believe. It's doubtful that many people assume that Malcolm X was the most prominent and admired civil rights leader of the early 60s. I think most people would say that Martin Luther King Jr. was in that category, with Malcolm X being perhaps a close second, but certainly not the great leader of the time. Malcolm X is mentioned much less than Martin Luther King in most histories, for example. So to make this statement that most people think that Malcolm X was the leading civil rights leader of his time, you're saying something that's really not true. It's an unfair summary of the opposing point of view. You're setting up a weak argument as your target and then disproving that. And this isn't a fair or impressive piece of persuasion. Instead, state the opposing point of view fairly, the way your opponent would state it himself or herself, and then disprove that. And then you'll avoid the straw man fallacy. Here's another fallacy to avoid. It's called the appeal to authority. It's not just enough to quote a source. The evidence that is based on that source must be convincing in its own right. Otherwise, you're guilty of the appeal to authority, which means trying to persuade the reader to accept an idea just because it comes from someone famous or respected. Let's say you're writing about Malcolm X, and you found a sentence in the writings of one of the leading scholars on the subject of civil rights, and this sentence strongly supports your thesis. It's fine to quote that sentence, you probably should, but that's not the end of your argument, it's just the beginning. What you want to do is not simply quote the sentence from Professor so-and-so and then act as though that proves your case and you can go on to other things. Instead, you should follow this up in your paper by saying something like this. I agree with what Professor so-and-so says, and in the rest of this paper, I will show with evidence why he is correct. Then you give all the other forms of evidence drawn from primary and secondary sources, statistics, data, quotations, all those kinds of things we talked about before. All that other evidence will support your point of view and show why both you and Professor so-and-so are correct. Simply quoting someone who's an expert or who should know is not in itself proof of anything, and therefore you can't rely on it as carrying the full weight of your argument. If you do try to rely on it, you're guilty of the appeal to authority, and it's not a very strong form of reasoning. And one more fallacy to watch out for is the ad hominem argument. This is another Latin tag, so it's another good thing to memorize and deploy when you want to impress people. The phrase ad hominem means against the person. And in a way, it describes a fallacy that's the opposite of the appeal to authority. The appeal to authority attempts to use the good reputation of someone else to bolster your argument. When you use an ad hominem argument, what you're doing is criticizing an opposing point of view, not by showing why the opposing point of view is logically incorrect or why it's factually wrong. Instead, you simply attack the credibility of the person who states the point of view. Here's an example. Let's say that you find in your research that Professor what's-his-name expresses the opposite point of view from you about the philosophy of Malcolm X. And so you want to use Professor what's-his-name as an example of the point of view that you disagree with. It wouldn't be very persuasive if you wrote in your paper something like this. Professor what's-his-name claims the opposite of my thesis about Malcolm X, but we can safely disregard his position because Professor what's-his-name has been criticized for his involvement in unfair partisan attacks on other academics. Notice what we're doing in this sentence. We're simply saying Professor what's-his-name is not a very nice guy. He's done some things that have been controversial and that people have criticized him for, so therefore let's disregard him. That's really not a substantive argument. It doesn't provide evidence to prove that Professor what's-his-name is wrong. After all, even if Professor what's-his-name isn't that nice a guy, he could still be right about Malcolm X. You really need to offer substantive ideas to weaken Professor what's-his-name's position. Simply attacking him as a person is unfair and unconvincing. All of these forms of logical fallacies are prevalent throughout our society. You can probably think of your own example from the latest political speech or television commercial that you've watched. The fact that you see them out there all the time and that in some cases they may even be effective at persuading people doesn't mean that you ought to use them. Your teacher will be watching out for these types of fallacies with an eagle eye as he or she reads your paper. And if you fall into any of these traps, you're likely to lose points on the persuasiveness scale. Be aware of these kinds of fallacies. Look for examples of them as you read so that you'll enhance your own understanding of what can go wrong with logic and avoid committing these fallacies in your writing. All the suggestions we've offered so far will help you construct a strong, logical argument on behalf of your thesis, one that's backed up with lots of great evidence and one that doesn't commit any logical fallacies which would undermine or weaken your case. But there's one more important element in writing a great and persuasive research paper, and that is sounding persuasive as well as being persuasive. And this means using stylistic and organizational tricks that writers have developed over the years to give papers a tone that's reasonable, thoughtful, and balanced, and therefore more likely to persuade the reader. Here are a few of the best of these tricks. First, be forceful and direct. That means stating your point of view clearly and forthrightly. Remember early in this program our recommendation that you write a statement stating your thesis? It's a good idea to include that sentence or a version of it somewhere in your paper, preferably near the beginning. That way your reader will know right away what idea your paper is built around and will be able to easily follow that idea throughout the paper and to understand how the evidence supports it. Also, when you state your thesis, avoid using phrases like I believe, I think, in my opinion, it seems to me, and similar expressions. The reader understands that what you put in the paper is your point of view. These are your ideas, your opinions, and there's no special need to emphasize that fact. Whenever you say, in my opinion, it sounds a bit as though you're apologizing for injecting your own ideas, and there's no need to apologize. Just state it as a fact and let your reader decide for himself or herself whether they agree or not. Next, respond to key counter-arguments. Always try to anticipate the ways in which your reader may disagree with your thesis, the evidence that contradicts your position, for example, the arguments that others have raised or might want to raise in an attempt to show that you're wrong. It shouldn't be hard to figure out what those points of disagreement are, because if you've done thorough research, you've probably encountered all these contradictory theses and the arguments on behalf of them in your reading. Pick the most important of these counter-arguments, describe them, and do your best to show why you think they're wrong. It's better than ignoring the counter-arguments, which might make your reader feel as though you're ducking the question. It gives the impression that your argument is weak if you don't address the counter-arguments. Whereas if you do address the counter-arguments, even if you don't completely demolish them, it shows the reader, hey, this person takes seriously the job of persuasion and is trying to do an honest, forthright job of it. It will earn you more respect and more points on the persuasion scale. Next, make concessions when necessary. Chances are good that your thesis is not 100% convincing. After all, we live in a world of gray, not black and white. So when you find that an opposing point of view has some merit or is partially correct, and that your own point of view is not 100% correct, go ahead and say so. This is called making a concession. You're offering something to the other side, saying, well, you're right about that. When you say this in your paper and you do it gracefully, you can then move on to show why the arguments on your side of the debate remain stronger overall, so that your basic thesis is still correct, even though you've just made one small concession to the other side. For example, you might include in your paper a paragraph that goes something like this. This is an example of how you might make a concession to an opposing point of view. In her account of the election of 1860, Professor Houses contends that Lincoln and the Republicans were fully aware of the seriousness of the secession threat. In support of her position, she cites the following evidence, and the evidence is then cited. It seems clear that Professor Houses is correct in regard to certain Republicans, but most party leaders believed the opposite, as their speeches and published statements show. And you then go on to show those speeches and published statements to show that your point of view is really more correct than that of Professor Houses. Notice what this paragraph does. It does offer a concession by saying, well, Professor Houses is right about some Republicans. But what you're doing is conceding what's right about Professor Husis, but then going on to show how overall, on balance, your thesis, which disagrees with her, is actually the stronger one, the one that applies to more Republican leaders. When you concede the partial correctness of the opposing point of view, it helps your writing come across as fair and balanced, and that makes your arguments in support of your own position all the more convincing. When someone writes a paper that is totally one-sided, refuses to make any concessions, that acts as though the opposition is just totally wrong, they're just idiots and stupid, and why don't they see that I am 100% correct? If you write a paper that comes across that way, it actually makes you appear less correct, less logical, and less persuasive. So make concessions, and you'll find paradoxically that admitting that your opponent is partly right actually makes you appear more correct. Next, don't overstate your case. Related to this notion of making necessary concessions is the principle of not overstating your own case. Don't exaggerate your point of view. Instead, choose your words and phrases carefully to state your thesis precisely, covering the facts clearly and limiting your position to what the evidence clearly and strongly supports. So, if, for example, your research suggests that most Republicans, not all, believed that the South would not secede, and that this belief might have been one of several factors that helped them win the election, not the only one, and perhaps not even the most important one, then say it just like that, rather than making an exaggerated claim that all Republicans believe this and that this was the factor in the election. Instead, state it just the way your evidence supports it, and you'll come across as stating your point of view in a precise and accurate way, which is a good way of winning your readers' respect and ultimately agreement. Finally, put your strongest arguments first and last. In any piece of writing, just as in a play or movie or television show, the parts that we remember best tend to be the beginning and especially the ending. So when you're planning your paper and listing the pieces of evidence that you intend to include, think about which arguments, which pieces of evidence are the strongest or most convincing, and which ones are the weakest, because not all of your evidence is going to be equally persuasive. If at all possible, pick the two strongest pieces of evidence and put one of them first, the other one last, and then bury the weaker arguments in the middle, where they will get the least attention. This isn't being dishonest, it's just a way of putting your best foot forward and leaving your reader with a strong impression that your paper offers powerful evidence on behalf of your thesis. So in particular, if you've got one idea, one piece of evidence that is really the clincher, the thing that really proves that your point of view is correct, save that one, give it last, and hammer it home, and your reader will put down your paper and say, well, this writer really proved the point. Very persuasive paper, and that will boost your grade. Practice all these techniques and you'll find yourself crafting a paper that's not only well-researched and interesting, but highly persuasive, which will make a positive difference in your final grade. In our next program, we'll talk about how to handle one of the most psychologically difficult steps in writing any paper, producing the first draft. If you've ever suffered from writer's block or just had trouble getting those first few words on paper, you'll benefit from the techniques we'll be offering then. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and see you next time.
If you're getting ready to take your SAT, don't forget, your score can make or break your chances of getting into the college of your dreams. That's where Video Aided Instructions SAT Series, a complete SAT course on DVD, can make all the difference. Our comprehensive SAT series will help you prepare thoroughly with insider strategies for making sense of tough reading passages and sentence completions, mastering the tricky rules of grammar, usage, and mechanics, crafting a well-written, high-scoring essay, unraveling those mind-boggling math problems, avoiding lengthy computations by using proven shortcuts, and much more. Get that all-important edge over the competition with SAT Critical Reading, SAT Writing, and SAT Math. After viewing these exceptional programs, you'll be able to take the stress out of SAT success and maximize your score.